action. There we go.
Looks like you're muted there, Jeff.
You're muted.
Yes, I'll just talk long enough to turn it over to you and say that due to Rick's good efforts, my weak prediction that we talk about streets tonight is coming true. So there's his skill and my luck involved in that. All right, Rick.
Is
Take it
that
away.
it? Okay. Well, let's see if I can figure out how to use two screens on one.
And if you're interested in any of the images that we showed on Wednesday night or the official map, I've got them. If you don't.
Can everybody see an image of Taft Corners?
Yes.
Okay, this is the world's fastest put together PowerPoint. I literally was just getting back from bringing my son back from college unexpectedly about 15 minutes ago. So obviously everybody's quite familiar with this image. And I was discussing this with Matt earlier today. And Harvest Lane, I'm sure you're all very familiar with. It's designed to get you from Route 2 down at least to Marshall Avenue, if not across it. And it's not really a place where you're going to feel comfortable on a bicycle or trying to walk beside it. So I just wanted to talk about that a little bit. One of the things that you'll find with the network that's going to be drawn over on the east and then around what is currently Harvest Lane are interconnected streets. And I mentioned this earlier, but this is really important for a number of reasons, not least of which is emergency access, because we will be talking about streets that are not as wide as Harvest Lane and some of the others. So some may be concerned that, well, that's going to be a dangerous situation because, you know, you can't get trucks through there. Well, you will be able to get trucks through there. You'll be able to get cars through there just more slowly. And the other benefit you have to interconnected streets is just you've got an incredible number of additional ways of getting from one point to the next. The left-hand image doesn't take a mathematical genius to figure out there's only one way to get between A and B on a street. Excuse me. And between C and D, and for those who do like math, you actually have to use a factorial factor to figure out how many routes you get from one to the other without doubling back. If you double back, in other words, to get from C to D without doubling back doing this, there's actually 70 ways to get from here to there in a similar distance. So if there's a blockage or, you know, an accident, tree across the street, anything like that, a lot more options with an interconnected street network. I guess I have to admit somebody. So speed is a very, very important element in designing streets, and vehicle speed is what I'm talking about. This diagram is one that I prepared a couple of years ago based on accident reconstruction work that I have done and a lot of other data. And since I first prepared it, it's been adopted by the Federal Highway Administration and the Institute of Transportation Engineers in their traffic calming online manual. So it's been peer vetted and some extensively. What this tells you is that if a vehicle is traveling 20 miles an hour or less and there's an accident involving a pedestrian, and that pedestrian is struck by the motor vehicle, they're usually not long-term severe injuries. As that speed increases just a little bit, between 20 and up into the early 30s miles per hour, injuries increase dramatically. Up until when you get up to around only 36, 37 miles an hour, it's usually a fatal collision. So what does that mean? Williston street regulations, there's a design speed in your regulations of 25 miles an hour. And a lot of police departments and a lot of drivers think that going 5 or 10 miles an hour above a posted speed limit is okay. And from an enforcement perspective, it often is. But as you can see, that puts you right up quickly into the yellow to orange zone, where it's a much more dangerous speed than the slower speeds. Sorry, I keep bumping that. So most people walking and biking don't know this diagram. Thankfully, they're not geeks like me. But you can perceive it, because other than electric vehicles, now I'm talking combustion vehicles for the most part, their sound increases exponentially with their speed. And so the energy associated with that moving vehicle, you can perceive it, not just from the rapid speed, but also from the sounds that it makes. Electric vehicles, it's just the speed, their increased speed. And if you're walking, or if you have children and you want to have them, say, walk down to a store, go someplace, streets that feel safe and streets that don't. And generally the faster streets, of course, don't feel safe. So here we are to the one that I keep flipping to by mistake. And this isn't Russell Crowe in his latest movie, but we get the idea. In this environment on the left, that happens to be New Mexico, people don't act as human as they do when they're out on foot, and they get frustrated with traffic. And when you're in an auto-dominant environment, it's very easy to get frustrated, turn into some rendition of this person on the right, and start speeding. So I know Vermonters are all very nice and nobody ever loses their cool and everybody drives under the speed limit, right? Not exactly. I haven't measured speeds on Harvest Lane. I can, if this virus ever departs, which I think it will soon. But I did in South Burlington. I don't have an image because of the limited amount of time I had to put this together, but I can do that for a later presentation over the weekend or Monday. For the South Village project, we talked about some of these principles. And South Village, for those of you who don't know it, it's pretty much a residential agricultural community, but designed with a lot of the same principles of interconnected streets, narrower streets, more walking. And there was a proposed connecting road very much like Harvest Lane between what was then undeveloped South Village property and the adjacent subdivision. So I did measure speeds on that, and it was posted at 30 miles an hour, but the typical speeds were all in the 45 mile an hour range. That was the median speed, or 85th percentile, which it's different, but that's usually the speed that streets get posted at. So if we come back to this diagram, obviously that's a very dangerous speed. And in that instance, that collector was the street or road between two adjacent subdivisions, and folks wanting to cross, let's assume this was that collector because Harvest Lane is actually detailed much like it. If you wanted to cross from a subdivision on this side to one on this side, you had to cross that street with those fast vehicles. That's not counting, by the way, the aberrant drivers. There were a few actually that exceeded 60 miles an hour, but I attributed those to young people showing off or otherwise skewing the data. So speed is important. It's directly related to the width of the street. It's related to the length of the street between intersections, and just curvilinear streets that curve for no reason other than just because. There's not really any topographic reason for a curve like that. There's not really any particular environmental reason for a curve like that. It's just to, quote unquote, make it somewhat interesting. But it actually encourages speed, because if you're going from 2 down to Marshall on a street like that, there's really no other reason to be on Harvest except to get from this point to this point relatively quickly. There's another reason why curves were introduced in streets like this for no reason, but I won't get into that tonight. We'll save that for later. And that is the very fast presentation to show you. Here's one example of one street that might possibly become a part of the street palette here in the area where we've got mixed use. We will have sidewalks. We may have cycle tracks, which are separate bicycle facilities out of the street, where you can have a space that it feels comfortable to let children go because they're not bicycling in the street. A little bit narrower, curb to curb width for streets. And this is what it looks like down at the bottom in plan view with that cycle track up on the street. So if you have any questions, I'm ready to discuss if you'd like.
So Rick, this is Tim Carney. I guess what I think you're saying is that the effective traffic calming measures to provide safety in a pedestrian street environment might be narrower streets, and I'm not sure what else, but it seemed like the narrower streets was part of the formula there. So as you look at, let me ask you this question: if you're going to rebuild Harvest Lane, what would that look like, and how would those features contribute to traffic calming?
Well, let's just see if I can find something that might help with that. Bear with me a second here.
Of course.
I sent a very quick sketch on that. Well, I'll tell you what, since I can't put my hands on it. I'll just describe it.
Perfect.
Narrowing the street is one aspect of doing this. A traffic calming principle is to also limit forward view. And the way you do that without putting in things like roundabouts and other things that actual physical interventions in a street is you provide deflections. So rather than having a continuous curve, you have streets that do something like this. So it's straight segments. So what happens when you have straight segments of a street, when you're coming along the street in this direction, if there's a building or some other feature here, you're actually looking at that. And that's providing you a visual terminus of that vista down the street. And then you have to make the turn, which is a little bit sharper, completely easy to do at slow speed, uncomfortable to do at higher speeds. So that is another important element. And then also just having smaller blocks with more intersections. So whether you have stop signs, Jeff found that. So if you look at just the Harvest Lane portion of this, instead of doing this big sweeping curve, if you did this sort of a situation with two T intersections, and this would be Trader over here. Now, instead of having one continuous, rather high speed alignment, if you're coming along Harvest into Trader Lane, you'd stop here. If you're coming up Harvest, heading towards 2, this would be a stop condition here. That's a more extreme than I was just diagramming with deflections. This is actually introducing T intersections. In Australia, for a number of years, they, for traffic calming purposes, precluded 4-way intersections and required T intersections. That's an interesting design problem when you get to trying to implement it, but it did and does work. So it's about the width of the street and the geometry and the alignment of the streets. Does that help?
Yeah, helps a lot. Thank you.
And Rick, you did mention street trees friction.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's another, the traffic calming elements, they're active, but I'll call them aggressive things that are a little bit bothersome, like speed humps. But then there are supportive elements. And what Jeff just mentioned is a supportive element. If you narrow the optical width of a street, where it actually feels, and you can perceive this as you drive in and out of built up areas. If you go through a village where there are buildings up to the street, you will naturally drive more slowly than that exact same street or highway, which may be the exact same width, the exact same alignment, but if it falls off into countryside as you leave the village and it's just fields, you will naturally speed up. So by providing street trees, pedestrian scale lighting, and other elements along the side of the street, you've narrowed that optical width. And that's a supportive element. It also helps to slow down the speeds of the vehicles. Thanks for reminding me, Jeff.
You just mentioned lighting, and it's one of my curious topics, because I'm curious about how we can have effective lighting outside and still protect dark skies. So is that a common element to be included, the dark sky approach with outdoor lighting in a situation like this?
It is, and that's definitely part of current thought. And you can provide pedestrian scale lighting that does in fact light down and not up.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, you'll be seeing, that's what Steve Price is putting in his transformations. He was talking about it earlier yesterday. I think he just took a special class in that. Was that it, Steve?
I took a class in astronomy, and
oh, that was it.
Astronomers kept saying, what are we doing with our cities? Nobody can see the Milky Way anymore. So yeah, and it also screws up wildlife migration patterns. It's disturbs people's sleep if their melatonin rhythms are messed up because there's light that's heading in all kinds of directions, not just down. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons for dark sky lighting, and it needs to go down. It's not enough that it just doesn't go up, because it shouldn't go sideways either. It should go down.
So this is another curiosity I have. So the current, if I understand this right, the current zoning requirements for street lighting in Williston call for a maximum height of 25 feet. And that seems awfully high to me. And I'm just interested in what you might think about lowering that height.
I'll just throw this in. It makes a difference what you're lighting. If it's a section of freeway or a baseball field, that's one thing. But if you're lighting the street, then it does make some sense if that, and I mean street, a complete street where you're lighting the cars and the sidewalk. It makes sense, and you've got street trees. It makes sense that they're lower. I mean, I really think about those Cobra heads. If you've got healthy street trees, a lot of that light's never going to get through the tree down to the ground. So some of it is in the it's not rocket science category.
Well, it's interesting to hear you say that, because in neighborhoods like the neighborhood I live in, we have 25-foot tall streetlights, which just seem excessive here because there's not much going on at all. And so, but as I understand it, that's the maximum height. There's no specifications in the zoning rules that kind of describe why it might be lower or anything else. And my suspicion is, since that's the maximum height, that's what's the most commonly used height.
The reason there's the reason for lights, the Cobra lights and other thing, if you have fewer taller lights that are very bright, you don't need as many of them. And from a pure cost perspective, just doing an engineering analysis of illuminating a street and without thinking about, oh my gosh, there's people on that street too, you will end up with a very few, very bright, very high lights. The other thing with the very few, very high, very bright lights is when you are a pedestrian, the one pedestrian that walks on a street like that and look up, you won't see the sky at night because you just see that bright light. So, having the pedestrian scale lights, it is generally a little bit more costly. Each light in itself costs a little bit less, but you need more of them. And you don't provide the same, there are all sorts of fancy lighting consultants that can tell you the exact number of lumens per square foot and all that kind of thing, but you kind of know what feels right and what doesn't feel right when you're out there as a pedestrian. And having enough light to know what's going on is nice, but you don't want to feel like you're in a spotlight on a stage.
Yeah, in the with all the conversion to LED, which is very efficient from an energy standpoint. The problem is that the 5,000 Kelvin lights, which a lot of cities put in the tall Cobra heads because they're really bright, but they're also tend to be shifted more towards the blue spectrum, which is really disturbing to sleep patterns and so forth. And it has this kind of prison yard character to it. Whereas, the dark sky people say do the 3,000 Kelvin, which is a warmer white, and all the surveys of the public indicate that that's what the public prefers because it has a much more a warm feeling. And you notice that all the new cars now have these bright LED lights that when you look down the street and have them staring in you. You can't see anything else other than the headlight of this car coming at you. So, which is unfortunate that cars are going in that direction. But the lower Kelvin is, I think, is probably something that more cities need to consider rather than going with the tall lamps with a high Kelvin, 5,000 Kelvin. I have a question for you, Rick. So, how do you decide, when you put the cycle tracks on a street? Is there a certain kind of, traffic counts or whatever that you decide when cycle tracks are? And a lot of cities will just put out bollards. They'll just put some paint down and some bollards to separate the cycle track from the vehicular traffic. Is that a good solution, or what's the argument for putting them up on the sidewalk?
Well, bollards are problematic in snow country, and you can take them out, but then you've taken them out for plowing. So, and they also penetrate the asphalt in the street, which creates a freeze thaw issue when you do remove them, and if they're not, they get to be expensive. So it can work as a test scenario. Flexible bollards can work as a good test scenario to see if you'll get more bicyclists if you want to test a route on an existing facility. But it's often not a completely fair test because you might be testing, say, Harvest Lane, that's going to be a difficult route to test because it's just the way it's detailed already. So to answer your question, there's thankfully no chart that says at 4,122 cars a day you put in a cycle track and 4,121 you don't. It really is, it's more of a desire line question, and that's where we need to hear from the community, because I had the opportunity to redesign all of the streets in the capital city of Abu Dhabi, and every one of those streets had cycle tracks for reasons that aren't important here other than it really worked there. So it's a good thing. It's a good feature to add into a street, I think, when you're thinking about all modes of transportation. But even it's not all just positives. It does make the street wider. So those buildings we talked about before, they will be a little bit farther apart on a street with cycle tracks than one without. So are the buildings going to be taller on that street? Are they going to be a little bit lower on that street? so the optical width traffic calming effect is impacted by a cyclotrack. It's like any other aspect of a street in an environment like this. It's actually a little bit more difficult than doing a typical subdivision street. Williston has, I think, 3 or 4 types of typical streets, which is actually more than many communities have. Most just have 1 or 2. And in this environment, it pretty much just has, from a curb to curb perspective, it just has 1 typical. And it's actually a good typical, but we need to be able to provide, and we will show a palette of more options for when we get done with this, because it's really, it's a lot of specificity, and you have to be able to adapt. You may find that 2 blocks along a street are different than the blocks on either side of it. So sorry, I'm not dodging your question. I'm actually trying to answer it with some of the factors involved.
I saw a question from Reed in the chat. I just want to make sure that she felt like that was sufficiently answered.
And for anybody who's not seen the chat, the question was about, what influence does Williston have over lighting? And we do regulate outdoor lighting. It's part of our site plan review. Our outdoor lighting chapter was modeled on model dark sky ordinances. So generally, what that means is lights are shielded so that no light is shining upward of the horizontal plane. And then, when we review almost any site where lighting is happening, we're looking for a couple things. We're looking to see that light's not trespassing off of the site, so it's all shining on the subject parcel. We do have maximum amount of light per acre in a lumens per acre standard. Maximum brightness of any one spot, so that there can't be hot spots beyond a certain intensity. And then the area that's lit has to be lit in at a certain level of uniformity. And that's really important, because you can actually have a lower light level if it's more uniform, because your eyes adjust. If you have lighting that's really, really bright and then not so bright, and you're moving through that, the effect is you feel like you're walking through dark spots, because as you're moving, your eyes aren't adjusting. So maximum brightness, no light trespass, no light shining upward, uniformity, and maximum brightness of a hot spot on the plan. And if you go by Cottonwood Crossing sometime after dark, you can see the lights in front of Community Bank, which are street lights for the street entering in there. And those are downward shielded. They're also a lot less than 25 feet in the air. It's a much more urban looking light. I think they're about 15 feet. And as a result, there's more of them along the street, but it's part of the streetscape in that project. So now that I've told you all about lighting in Williston, you won't be able to go anywhere at night in Williston and not think about it like I do.
Is it okay if I sort of redirect the conversation to another topic?
Sure.
Okay. So, I've been here the last couple nights, and so far tonight, there's been a focus on streets and traffic and buildings and how they all look, focusing on the areas that are closest to the big box stores and where all the activity occurs. Now, as you look at the outer edges of the Tap Corners area, and I'm directing your thinking back to that parcel currently owned by the church, and perhaps some other open parcels as well. How do you see this form-based zoning sort of guiding the possible development of those places that are not really tightly, are not, so close to what's currently the center of all the activity today?
Well, ultimately, that's going to be for you to approve. So I'll tell you the kind of initial thoughts are, well, before I say that, someone owns that land and has ideas about what they want to do on it. So there's a conversation there. But the initial ideas are, it is, the Alliance Church specifically, it's clearly a place that, there's retail doesn't really make much sense there. It's off the beaten path. On the other hand, it's in the targeted growth area. It's in Taft's Corners, and it's a short. If you lived there, if there were houses up there and housing, it's a pretty short walk. It's a little bit, well, actually, it's quite a lot living in Finney Crossing, since I think most of the routes would either take you through or right on the edge of Finney Crossing. So it's almost mislead by thinking of it as an extension of Finney Crossing. But my initial thought is, and I think the teams make sense for residential, and I would think more dense than single family detached houses, something in the missing middle, the missing middle from maybe duplexes or row houses up to apartment buildings, depending. So it's an opportunity. In contrast to looking at some of the parking lots, now that with the understanding of the lease agreements, it looks like kind of a layup, to use a 5'6" person's basketball analogy. That mean, and of course developing is never that easy, but the land is there. It's an easy connection. It's really not too far out. And I have to mention, if VTech really moves in, that'd be a great place for professors and graduate students to live, et cetera. So I think a lot of housing could go up there. That would add pretty efficient in terms of their use of, every lineal foot of utility line, sewer line, roadway, and sidewalk would be pretty well used.
Well, that makes a lot. Yeah, I get it. It makes a lot of sense. So I'm throwing this out for the team, and perhaps with a particular ear for Matt, who's familiar with the zoning and perhaps the use in that property. But maybe there's a way to incorporate some protection for park or public space out there somewheres that would support the views. I think there's a view of Mount Mansfield from there. That type of thing. And as I said, as I perhaps mentioned before, there's no doubt that's a deer yard. There are deer that go up and through there, and if that, to the extent that's important to the people in the town, I think they should know about that.
Well, one thing I can throw in, it's not completely without some wetlands. So, and I think part of the idea with that, if there's relatively intense housing, that getting up into the middle and the top end of the missing middle, public open space goes with that.
Cool. Thank you. You mentioned VTC, so tell me in 2 minutes or less what you know about what's the possibilities are with that. I'm unfamiliar with what might.
Well, yeah, the 10-second synopsis, and I had to leave that meeting. Justin might want to join in. Is a lot's up in the air, but it's very possible. I think they have a lot of uncertainty, but they're interested. Justin? And Justin's playing with that site, trying to show them some things that'll get them more excited.
Yeah, definitely looking at, I mean, in terms of housing, definitely looking at a variety of housing in that location. And, kind of thinking about how, Taft Corners kind of goes from the most intense. And once you kind of get to the Cottonwood Crossing area, we're starting to kind of get towards what will sort of be the new edge of the sort of intense development. So looking at ways to kind of, decrease the density and start to kind of, integrate different types of housing there. Even perhaps some stacked flats, so they look like townhouses from the outside, but they might be multiple apartments inside. Even something like a triple decker. So you get sort of the advantages of being almost like in a single family house, but you sort of have the affordability of an apartment style of living.
Do you mind if I jump in on VTC real quick, Jeff?
No, please.
I think, I would, so Tim, I was in that meeting as well. And I think, they're uncertain about what's going to happen with the other state colleges and funding in the future. I think that's the reason for the uncertainty. But I mean, they brought the big guns to the meeting. They brought Pat Moulton, who's the chancellor of the state colleges, and they brought the dean of the VTC campus. And they certainly see a lot of value in the VTC campus, and perhaps making it, all up in the air, but perhaps making it a little bit more residential, or at least wanting to integrate the campus a little bit more into the fabric of Williston, instead of having it kind of be the separate place in a circle. And I think, they know that the lifespan of what the buildings that they have is probably only another 20, 25 years. And that at some point in the future, if they're here, they're going to be looking to redevelop the land they own. So I think that's what they could give us. But it sounds like they're very much committed to staying in Williston if possible, and perhaps even growing.
Yeah, I think that's pretty cool for a lot of reasons. But think about their classroom space too. And I'm throwing this out for part of that discussion as it may unfold. Is if there's some way to provide access to their classroom space that's not being used in the evenings, in the summertime, or wherever that might be, at least to include that in the discussion. It can be a great resource for businesses, for community organizations, churches, and so forth. They have, places to instruct and teach people about things.
It's funny you mentioned that, because that's actually something they mentioned in the meeting, is that, kind of pre-COVID, that was something they were really starting to explore and wanted to do. Mm-hmm. And then COVID hit. Yeah. So Tim, we can, I think, Matt was on the VTC call too. So Matt's on it. I think Williston folks are on it. And I think, try to make that connection in next year or two when COVID clears up would be really beneficial to Williston.
That's cool. I'll just finish with this. When I was in business, I wanted to hold seminars, and I contacted the community college system, and they have a prohibition against using their classroom space by for-profit organizations, which just astounded me, but that's what they do. And at UVM, they had two different prices for using their classrooms, one for nonprofit and one for for-profit. And since I was a self-employed for-profit guy, I scratched my head about that. So, throwing that out there for part of the mix is that, at least have a conversation about how to set up access and reasonable access, because it can be extremely valuable for small business people.
Yeah, I take it back to something that was briefly mentioned about VTC in this conversation that I think I took away was integration into the community. And one thing that the VTC folks mentioned, they do have a small amount of residential on-campus housing there in the brick building that has Stilettos Salon in it in the bottom. And also they had an increase in student population before COVID, where they were renting some of the Finney Crossing apartments. And students who were able to do that really liked it. They really liked, that between them and VTC was a shopping center with a deli and other things that they could do. That it was to some degree walkable. If you could find a signalized crossing to 2A, you could get yourself over there. So physically integrated with the surrounding community, and then programmatically in the ways you've been talking about, I think they see a lot of value in that. And there are things we can talk about in terms of what we plan for in the future, in terms of the layout in Blair Park and how that aligns with what all else might be going on in Taft Corners, particularly if you have Helena Drive turn into a signalized intersection with crosswalks that takes people onto a new street, Trader Lane. Now you have walkability over to, at least today, to Wright Avenue and CVS and the bank, but eventually, to more and more things. So connectivity and integration, both programmatically and physically. The other thing I'll say about VTC is, they did say a lot of our students are commuter students and they come from 30 miles away. And, they face some challenges around accommodating demand for parking for that. So whether it's on their site or just maybe the place in general, and we start looking at how parking demand ebbs and flows in that part of Taft Corners, if there's opportunity for sharing, that's something we really might want to think about. There's a nail salon adjacent to VTC that has a very different peak parking demand than VTC. And both experience times when respectively their parking demand is almost more than they can support. There's an opportunity there to consider parking that might serve both and therefore not have to be as big for either.
It also recalls the conversation that was there last night about some kind of a shuttle service with the expected pressure on fewer cars coming down the road because of carbon concerns.
I'm seeing a number of folks in the room tonight who I think were at the kickoff, but maybe haven't been able to be part of one of these update nights. And I just wanted to throw it out to the group. These meetings have been, really pretty informal and round robin in nature, as you're seeing. So we've talked a lot about transportation infrastructure and street layout and design and safe street speeds for cyclists and pedestrians tonight. But if you have follow-up questions on that or any other questions about where we're at or the project schedule, please feel free to jump in or type in the chat if you don't want to speak. I think this is one of the larger of the update meetings we've had looking at the attendee list. And there's also no requirement that we go for a full hour. So, Reed, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
I'm assuming you all have made this connection somewhere along the line in your conversations, but just talking about VTC and earlier mentions of a community center. And I'm not sure what kind of spaces people felt they needed in a community center, but those might be things that VTC would have or would consider constructing. I don't know, things like a large lecture hall or a space with a small stage, a performance space. Those would be things that VTC would use, but then in their off hours could be available to the community.
Yeah, there's been a long simmering conversation in Williston about desire for community center. We've talked about it a little bit in these meetings this week, and whether the plan for Taft Corners should accommodate the creation of municipal spaces, civic spaces like that. And I think that conversation about how should the plan anticipate those things is great. And then there's also a conversation that's upcoming in the town of Williston that was planned for, before we got into this particular conversation about Taft Corners, which is to actually go out and study what the communities need and want for a community center is. And also think about locations sort of town-wide. And is it one big facility on 50 acres somewhere, or is it well, the needs are actually quite diverse. Some might be for indoor recreation, some might be for places of assembly or lecture halls or classrooms. Some places, my wife works in Winooski, where the community center has a large community kitchen that can be rented out. So there's all different kinds of things that people think about when they think about community center. And it might be one building, it might be space in several buildings. Some of it might be in Taft Corners, some of it might not. And I think the thing I want to emphasize is just that conversation is really wide open right now, because most of it hasn't happened yet. But the conversation here about how should Williston begin to plan for the civic involvement in Taft Corners. We know we want to maintain our municipal presence up on the hill in the village. The town offices being there has occasioned the preservation and maintenance of a number of really important historic structures there, including my building that I work in. Those are buildings that giving them a reason to exist, like having town offices, is probably one of the best ways to save them. But we also know those buildings don't have very large meeting space. When we want to do town meeting, we have to go across the street to Central School. When we want to have in-person voting, we generally have to go to the Armory next door. So there are needs that are going to extend beyond that. And then that question of, as more and more people are living most of their lives in Taft Corners, what role does the town play in that? And how do we begin to plan for those spaces? Do we have any other questions or final thoughts for tonight before we take a night off? Not that I'm, wanting a night off on Friday, but I'll be wrestling with an easy up tent Saturday morning in front of Healthy Living. So I need my rest Friday evening.
Well, we may be calling you up at odd hours of the night with questions. So don't be careful about that night off thing.
Will do. Well, I think unless I see anybody waving madly or in the chat, I'll thank everybody for coming out tonight. Again, come see us out front of Healthy Living Saturday morning, and plan for Monday evening, May 3rd, and bring your friends and neighbors, especially Monday evening. We really want to pull as many folks back into that as we can. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming out tonight. Enjoy your
Thanks, everyone.
rainy Thursday evening, and we'll see you all again soon. Thanks.
Good night.
Great. Good night.
Good night.